So if for some reason you're willing to trust me, a complete stranger, yes, just go read Gardens of the Moon. It's awesome. But people have a lot of things to say about this book, and if you've heard things that make you hesitate, keep watching. So first I'd like to say I'm trying out a new setup. I got some lights after a very helpful conversation I had with Theo at the Rekindled Reader. Efklisto Theo. So full disclosure, I started reading this book in the early 2000s and I didn't make it through. I think I got about halfway through and I DNF'd it. And I tried again maybe 5 years later, and I also didn't make it through. And then, as I've mentioned before in previous videos, I had nothing to do during the pandemic. I was unemployed, I was single, I couldn't go out with my friends, I couldn't really do much. I had a lot of time sitting around at home. And I read this and I was hooked. It's become, I'm sorry, Professor Tolkien, it's become my favorite fantasy series ever. So let's look at the basics and get those out of the way so we can get on with the exciting stuff. So Gardens of the Moon was written by Steven Erikson. It was published for the first time in 1999 by Tor Books. And this particular edition, mass market paperback, is 657 pages. And it's the first book in a large series called the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which are 10 pretty fat books. In fact, they seem to get fatter and fatter as it goes towards the end. The last one is the thickest one. And they're amazing. So I was thinking that a good way to cover the scope of this book is just to talk about what it's got. What is actually in this book? So what it's got, as quickly as I can. Insane battle scenes. A flying city the size of a mountain. A psychotic puppet sorcerer. Some of the best buddies in fantasy. A rich and detailed hard magic system. A pantheon of meddling asshole gods. Super strong female characters. Fat characters that aren't villains and are not mocked. Gender equality. Every imaginable skin color, including blue and green. 7 sentient races. Multiple maps. Crazy people throwing bombs. A truly terrifying magical sword. Giant, talking, magic-eating ravens. An army that's been undead for millennia. Countless serious badasses. Spies, demons, dragons, shapeshifters. Shape-shifting dragons. Epic action scenes. 93 named characters. An awkward teenager. Grizzled veterans. Humor. Brilliant prose. A beautiful city with a seedy underbelly, thieves, assassins, and a shadowy sorcerer's cabal, an author who trusts your intelligence, and a wonderful community of supportive and spoiler-conscious fans. Whew! What's it not got? A main character, a group of main characters, a quest, a chosen one, white hat good guys, black hat bad guys, reader handholding, info dumps, an easy to hate evil race, romance, an evil overlord, and a neatly tied up plot. So before getting into the story, I think it's good to get a little context. If you think of there being 2 different kinds of fathers, one, when teaching his child to swim, gets in the pool with them, holds them, makes sure that they're not drowning, helps them paddle around a little bit, reassures them, makes sure that they're doing okay before letting them go. Then there's the kind of father that pushes their kid into the pool. Steve pushes the reader into the pool. It's possibly the hardest thing about Gardens of the Moon. It begins and you will be confused. But I can give you a little context, which maybe makes things a little easier at the beginning. So the whole thing takes place on the continent of Genabacchus. And there is an empire. Think Roman Empire, something like the ancient Roman Empire. They are slowly invading most of the world, it appears like, and they have invaded Genabacchus. They still have two cities that they haven't taken care of yet. One is Pale, and one is Darujistan. And Pale, which is further north, is pretty much where the story starts. It starts at the Siege of Pale. The Second Army of the Malazan Empire has surrounded the city and is giving one last big push. They are met by the people in Pale, but also by a flying city the size of a mountain, which is hovering above Pale, helping in their defense. That gives you a little bit of context for where the book starts, because what really happens is there is an epic action scene, which is a huge battle with demons, a flying city, mages, soldiers, people dying left and right. It's a mess. It's super chaotic. There's a million things going on, and it can be kind of confusing. The story, the first third of the book, mostly follows an elite unit of the Second Army of the Malazan Empire, who are called the Bridge Burners. They are veterans, one and all. They've been through a lot together and are a very, very close found family. They are at the Siege of Pale, and it appears that perhaps the Empire has betrayed them and tried to kill all of them during the battle. That's the opening tension. I'm telling you things that are in the second chapter at the latest, so it's not really spoilers yet. And a lot of the first third of the book follows the bridge burners and people that have things to do with them. So we get to know them relatively well. At some point, the perspective moves to Darujistan, the city in the south that the Malazans have not invaded yet. And we meet a group of dodgy underbelly people. There's a fence of stolen goods who is hilarious, but not everybody agrees on that. There's an assassin. There's a thief. There's a professional seducer. And there's an alcoholic who has fallen from grace. And they have their own lives, they have their own stories going on, but the thing hanging over them and all of Darujistan is the oncoming Malazan army. Everybody knows they're coming and is not so certain what exactly to do about it. The story in and of itself is very simple. There's the army moving from Pale to Darujistan in the south. Then there are the people in Darujistan preparing to be invaded. That is more or less the story. The end of the book is the epic climax, truly epic scene where they all come together and some crazy shit happens. The book is much more about the world and the characters than it is specifically about the story. The story is primarily driven by the Empress, and she's very far away and not even in the book. The characters we spend time with and what they experience of the world is what's so amazing about this book and about the whole Malazan Book of the Fallen. The world is so rich. There is so much history going back thousands of years. There are so many different kinds of people, whether they're human or not. There is an amazing magic system, and there is unbeatable action. That is really what you get into the Malazan Book of the Fallen for, as well as the themes, which brings us to the themes. Obviously, in a book about an empire invading other places, it's going to be a lot about imperialism and also colonialism. How does all of this work? One of the things I constantly had to think of is that Monty Python skit.
And what have they ever given us in return? The aqueduct?
There's a lot of that in this as well. And there's a lot of feeling like the Malazans are the good guys. Oh, actually, imperialism's pretty crappy. But I like the Malazans that we're spending time with. But they're declaring war on people who are just going about their lives. There's a lot of this back and forth. with these issues, and at no point is it clearly laid down, this is a thing which is bad. This is something Erikson doesn't do. He also doesn't lay down, this is a thing that is good. And it's actually what I love most about him. He shows you things that are good. He shows you things that are bad. They belong to the same issue. And it's up to us as readers to have our own opinions about it, to make our own judgments. Obviously, the book has a lot to do with war. War is one of the big themes. Not only how war is conducted or why the war is happening, but also how it affects everything, how it affects the highest levels, how it changes the empire, but also how it affects very individual people who are mentally scarred by what they've seen, who are physically scarred by wounds, and maybe who die. Death is also a thing. Religion is also one of the big issues. There is a lot of meddling by the gods. There are quite a few of them. They get actively involved in people's lives, and there are a lot of questions raised about how much power gods have and how much of that power that they do have is given to them by people. So are we, in the end, responsible for the gods? It's a huge theme in all of the books, the idea of a found family and friendships. There are some really, really strange friends in this, people that, or maybe not even people, but you get characters who are together for the strangest of reasons, or who come together seemingly completely coincidentally and end up being extremely, extremely strong friends and have very moving emotional relationships with one another, moving to me or you, the reader. And it's a constant examination of how friendships happen. There's a little romance-ish kind of stuff, not so much in this book, but later in the series. But it's much, much more about friendships and what friends will do for each other, even when it's extremely unpleasant, when they really don't want to, but they will because they love each other. And one of the biggest themes, I guess you could call it, this moral grayness that everyone talks about. Erikson never tells us what's right or wrong, and there are no characters where he allows us to have the comfort to lean back and think, I know who the good guy is, I know who the bad guy is, and the bad guy's only bad and the good guys can do no wrong. There's nobody like that in all of the books. There's one particular character in Gardens of the Moon where at the beginning you think, wow, this is maybe a monster. This is maybe a really, really horrible person. It sounds like they are. And then in one dramatic scene, it all turns around and you can't help but think, oh, okay, yeah, maybe they're a monster, but I unfortunately now kind of understand why. And I had to stop and think, would I be any different maybe in the same situation? If those things had happened to me, how good a person would I be? And exactly the same thing happens with our good characters, the characters we meet at the beginning who are like, oh, I like this person. I want to follow this person around. I think they are good. I enjoy them. They are probably good people. End up doing some horrible things where you can't help but sit back and think, okay, not quite as good as I originally thought they were. We never get the comfort of knowing this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, because Erikson will present us with somebody, and then 100, 200 pages, maybe 2 books later, he'll present us more information about that person, and we have to rethink all of the judgments we made. And that's actually one of the things I love most about his writing. So I guess I can call this section, It's Not For Everyone. I hate that phrase. People say it all the time, it's not for everyone. And very often what it feels like they mean is, I am smart and I am correct. And therefore, if it's not for you, you are not as smart and you are wrong. And that's not at all what I mean. What I mean is, it's really not for everyone. If you're looking for a fun romp that's simple and entertaining to read, and that's all, this is not for you. It is entertaining to read, but it's not simple. If you don't like having to really pay attention, if you don't like having questions that are unanswered and maybe unanswered for a long time, it's not for you. If you have an irrational fear of military fantasy, it's probably not for you. The book doesn't only follow the soldiers, but there is a lot of soldier in the book. If you couldn't get through A Song of Ice and Fire because there's so much going on, maybe this isn't for you. And if you're terrified of committing to a 10-book series, it may not be for you. I'm currently rereading it, as I said in one of my previous videos, and I've made the, I think, smart decision to pad the Malazan books out with other books in between. First of all, because I just get too much FOMO. I fear missing out on interesting new books that people are recommending, and I'm committed to this Malaz everything read, and I just can't read anything else until 2025. I'm not doing that to myself. So I think that's actually maybe not a bad way to read Malazan just in general. If you start with Gardens of the Moon, if you're really excited and motivated, go straight into Deadhouse Gates, the next one. But at some point, probably after Deadhouse Gates, because it's a very emotionally wrenching story, I felt wrecked after reading it both times. In a good way. But it was a book I needed a break from. It was a book I needed a break after. I didn't read anything for a couple of days just because I was thinking about it so much. And then I read something else entirely, which was a really good palate cleanser. It got me out of Malazan for a little while. I read something simpler, more straightforward fun. And now I've gone back to Malazan and I'm reading Memories of Ice, the third book. But I think it's not for everyone. But if you think it might be for you, and I encourage everyone to at least give it a chance, I have some advice on how to do it. Philip Chase actually said this. He's read this book twice, and he said that he wishes that he had not obsessed so much about mastering the lore of the book. He was flipping back and forth to the character list constantly and looking at the map constantly and essentially pulling himself out of the story constantly to try and figure things out about the world and the characters. He says he wishes he just rolled with it more and was relaxed about it. My advice is to approach it as if it's an action mystery. When you read a mystery novel, you go into it knowing and accepting, because that's the whole point of a mystery novel, that there are mysteries, that there are things going on in the story that you may not understand at all until the very end. And you go into it trusting the author to make those things clear to you by the end. And I would recommend the same thing with Malazan. The story itself doesn't really have any big mysteries. The story is pretty straightforward, as I said before. But the world itself is very mysterious. There are a lot of things going on. The magic system is very complicated and confusing at the beginning. Nobody ever sits down and explains it to you. There are hints, there are examples, all of that sort of stuff all along the way. And you put it together as you go. If you, just like a mystery novel author, if you trust Steven Erikson to really get to it, to not leave you hanging, to explain it all by the end, you will be rewarded. Yeah, you can trust him and you can trust me when I say that. You can trust him. He will actually explain these things by the end. Not necessarily the end of this book. Maybe it'll take a little longer. But a lot of the mysteries that are created or hinted at in this book are explained. It just might take a little while. My other big recommendation is that you commit. I mean, of course, stop reading whenever you want, DNF it if you want. I will stop talking to you, but no, I'll keep talking to you. Keep reading it until the end of the third book. I think we all, as fantasy readers, we all commit to trilogies constantly. How many trilogies have you read? So if you just think of it as a trilogy, I'm going to read the first 3 books. If you get to the end of the second book and you are not emotionally devastated and invested in the characters, you are dead inside, maybe? No. You're probably not dead inside. It may just not be for you. But if you get to the end of the third book and you really think, okay, this is a slog, it's work, I'm not enjoying it, then of course it's not for you. But my experiences with a lot of people is the first book up until about halfway through, so Gardens of the Moon, they get about halfway through and they think, oh, yeah, maybe, I don't know, I feel a little confused and a lot of these things are really difficult for me. By the end of it, they're kind of in love with some of the characters. They still have a lot of questions, but they've become a little bit invested. By the end of the second book, they either think, hell no, this is too much for me, because as I said, it is a very emotional book, Dead House Gates. But the majority seem to then be totally in love with the world, totally in love with the characters, and totally hungry to see what happens next. So that's my recommendation for how to read it. So when I started this channel, I think in my very first video, I asked if people would be interested in my view as a designer on book covers and how book covers work, how they're designed, how well or not so well each book cover I look at is designed. So that's what we're going to do now. What's the function of a cover? I mean, obviously one thing is just to catch your eye on the shelf. Yeah, if it's really standout, interesting, or just because it has some bright colors or some gold foil, maybe it grabs your attention. So that's the very first function. You walk by it on the shelf, do you stop and look at it? But once you stop and look at it, I think it's important that it communicates something about the book. And I think of this kind of as a scale from atmospheric to illustrative. And atmospheric maybe doesn't represent something exactly that's in the book, but it gives you a feeling in some way. And that's, of course, a lot more subjective, a lot more vague. And then illustrative actually illustrates something out of the book. It's a clear picture of a character. It's a clear picture of a scene that's actually described in the book. There are recognizable things on the cover from the story itself. So also, if we're going to consider covers, I think it's important to consider the whole thing. So let's go to the table briefly and have a look. The front cover, which is what we normally think of when we think cover, yeah? But of course, the whole thing has some sort of value and some sort of purpose. So the spine has an interesting purpose in that is, in most cases, what is actually seen in a bookstore. Not all books can be face out. Most books are spine out. So it's great if a book has an eye-catching spine that then encourages you to look at the front and the back. The back is usually a blurb, and the blurb is usually, just for contrast's sake, it's usually put in a box so that it's readable, so that the text stands out enough that you can actually read it clearly. And Gardens of the Moon is no exception. So if we look at the elements on the front cover, we have the author's name, the title, the suggestion that it's part of a series. This is something that I would like to see a lot of publishers do better. Orbit is doing this excellently. All of the Orbit books that I have at the moment, I don't know if they do this on all of their books, but certainly all of the ones that I own have a number. If they're part of a series, they have a number on the spine, which clearly communicates this is number 1 in a series, this is number 2 in that series, and so on. It says on the cover, A Tale of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. First of all, if I'm a brand new viewer, I have no idea what the Malazan Book of the Fallen is. And it says a tale, which makes me think, is it a novel? Is it a novella? Is it just, what exactly is it? And where does it fit? I actually watched a video earlier that where a guy said he had started reading the Malazan Book of the Fallen on book 4. just because he didn't know any better. That's so easy to avoid. They could have put book 1 of the Malazan Book of the Fallen on the cover, and that would have been it. So simple. I design software for a living, so I tend to think of everything as an interface. An interface is basically how a human interacts with a thing, whatever it is. A doorknob is an interface to a door. And I think of book covers very much as being interfaces to the book. And communicating which book in a 10-book series that I happen to have in my hand when I know nothing about the series, that's actually a good interface. So if we look at the elements on the cover, we have the author's name at the top, we have the title of the book, we have that blurb at the bottom, like I said, and we have these weird little metal decorative elements sticking in on the sides, and then we have the art. The art, in this case, is painted by Steve Stone. I'd like to say that anything I say critical of any of this, I'm not trying to diss the layout artist. I'm not trying to diss the guy who painted the art. All of the responsibility for the entire cover rests with the art director who works for the publisher. I've worked on a lot of projects. I used to design books. There is one person at the publisher who is the last person responsible. They probably have the general idea at the beginning. They set down the requirements. The artist who paints and the layout artist who puts everything together, they're following instruction from the art director. And at the end, the art director is the one who says yes or no. And the art director is the one who decides this should or should not be published like this. We have to go back and do some changes or we're done. So if anybody should take this as helpful hints or criticism, it's the art director. So the author's name is in a typeface called Trajan. Trajan is two things. It is vastly overused, and it is historically quite interesting. There is a column in Rome called Trajan's Column. It's a victory column built a little over 2,000 years ago by a Roman emperor celebrating his victory, blah, blah, blah. It's 38 meters high, and it's still in extremely good condition. It's covered in amazing carvings up and down the entire length. And at the base is a room that you can actually go into. And above the door of that room on the outside, there is typography inscribed into the stone. Romans were amazing at doing this. I can't even imagine the work involved, but they carved beautiful lettering into the stone above the door. It's called Trajan's Inscription. And this typeface was based on that. It was designed by Carol Twombly in 1989, and it is used on every second fantasy book cover and half the movie posters in the world. Once you know what it looks like, you will see it everywhere. The title of the book is set in Moncton Regular, and it was designed by Adrian Williams, who said it was also inspired by the Trajan inscription. So it's a good pairing. This is something when you're designing things you really need to put a little thought into. If you're using multiple typefaces, do they actually go with each other? Do they have a harmonious effect? Do they complement each other? Even if they're very different, do they somehow feel like they go well together? And in this case, of course they do. The painting itself, I kind of wonder, what is it meant to be? I mentioned that scale from atmospheric to illustrative. This is definitely an illustration, but it's not actually an illustration of anything that's in the book. You could kind of make a stretch and say, well, it could be this, it could be that. But I looked it up, and there's actually a huge discussion on Reddit of people trying to figure out what this tower is even meant to be. So I don't think it's a fail on the point of the author, the artist. I think he's done a good job. It's a good painting of a tower with a moon in the background, but the briefing must have been very strange, or they just bought some existing art and thought good enough. I'm not sure. I really don't know what happened there. As far as the layout, it's really, really simple. Everything is centered, which is the simplest kind of design you can go for with something like this. And then there's these little metal decorative things. They're interesting. They were put on earlier editions of this with a band with little decorations on the end, and in the middle, a helmet. That helmet confused me for a long time. I think the first time I saw the book, I thought it was about Vikings, and I wasn't interested at the time. Not that Vikings are uninterested, but I just wasn't in the mood for a Viking thing, and that helmet looked very Viking something to me. So it was maybe a bit off. I think it's an interesting choice in a fantasy novel to use an accurate historical helmet that really did exist and represents a particular time period that doesn't exist in the fantasy novel. I find that kind of strange. In later editions, they moved away from that and just used those little curly metal decorative bits, which is actually a good idea. If you look at the first and the second covers, they otherwise have extremely little in common. The typography doesn't provide it a strong enough visual identity. And they, without those little metal bits, they could be two books, standalones, written by completely different people visually without reading the text. But those little metal bits are a consistent visual element that's used throughout the entire series, which ties them all together because nothing else does. So I'm going to give this the prestigious Madon Books GFC Award, which means Generic Fantasy Cover. There are a lot of these. This is a book that if I saw it on the shelf and I didn't know that Steven Erikson was such a brilliant writer, I would never pick it up based on the cover. It doesn't say anything to me. If anything, it's maybe confusing. Is this a vampire's tower? Do these metal things mean something? What is the Malazan Book of the Fallen? All of these as an interface, it doesn't tell enough to help me interact with this book in a way that's going to sell it. I would recommend they take a page from the French Malazan books and get Marc Simonetti to do the art for the covers. Take a look at this. He's done some stunning work for the French covers. Unfortunately, the French art director doesn't seem to know anything about briefing an artist or about laying out typography, because it's atrocious how they've destroyed these amazing illustrations by putting the title on top of it. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this, but more importantly, I hope I have made you at least curious to read Gardens of the Moon and maybe the rest of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. As I said, my mission is to have more people to talk to Malazan about, so if you happen to be on Mike's Book Reviews Discord or the Grimoire Discord, which I'll link both of them below, I'm on both of those and I'm active in the Malazan channels. I would be super happy to see new people. Let me know in the comments below if I managed to pique your curiosity, or if you've already read it and what you think. Even if you DNF'd it, like I said, I will not stop talking to you because of that. Everybody has their right to their opinion, especially if it differs with mine. Makes the world more interesting. So as always, keep reading awesome books. Like and subscribe, please. And I'll see you next time.